Okay, it's day 103, and this is part two. And a lot of came out of the Chris Clotworthy research. It looks like he's just a librarian for Resources for the Future, but he was a real right hand man to Molly McCauley, especially in this idea of land conservation. And maybe nothing to do with Chris Clotworthy, but the CIA used to love to make parks and zoos and different wildlife game areas and so forth in areas that they wanted to set aside for themselves in terms of resource mining. And I thought of the wildlife safari park in Oregon and the wildlife park that I went through on my way to Zanesville, that we stopped at and I actually did a show at. And so I started thinking, is this what really Resources for the Future is using these Landsat capability, this ability to this peacetime use of military technology like they had at the Stennis Space Center. So then I looked at this director, William Lupine, and he was involved with Imran Awan's ACG group, and also Uranium One. And I thought that was an interesting connection to New Mexico and McKinley, New Mexico. And I kind of combined this thinking with the stuff that had happened with looking at all the FBI involvement in Uranium One in New Mexico. And it just seemed like the FBI, almost through the BLM, but really the FBI, was involved in kind of this Uranium One thing, in the enforcement arm of this Uranium One, and taking down people. And they shot Lloyd Finnecum, if you saw that video yesterday, and very closely connected to Imran Awan and this ACG group. And this ACG group is very closely connected to the Navy. So this was kind of an eye-opener how tightly knit all these energy groups were, these energy companies, these uranium mines, to Resources for the Future, and to these kind of like wildlife parks. San Diego Zoo being one of them. I saw out in San Diego there was a Clotworthy construction. They did all these cell phone towers, and I immediately thought of Javier Becerra, or Xavier Becerra. I can't remember Xavier Becerra's first name, but the one who did the kind of there's odd coincidences with task forces beating, and of course he's committed a felony giving false information about what was on that server in the Democratic Caucus server. Now, Rahm Emanuel, you knew, was the caucus representative to the DCCC before, and so Imran worked for Rahm Emanuel. Imran's involved in this server with the McCluskey server, and again, why the office of Omar Awan down in San Diego? So is Becerra giving contracts to Clotworthy Construction, putting up these cell phone towers in areas, remote areas? I don't know. It'd be an interesting thing to look at. But so moving on to David Lambert, we've got him in this place in Dulles, Virginia, for 12 years, and then all of a sudden this new person's inserted for a couple of moments. So that's going to be an interesting thing to follow up on. With the news, I haven't seen if what the situation is with Rosenstein today or with Trump evaluating the memo. But then here is just another interesting connection. I believe this is going to be a San Diego connection, this David McKittrick, who's a senior systems analyst at the House of Representatives. Now, I don't know if he's Navy. I don't know if he's San Diego. I don't know if this is kind of the Navy play in San Diego with contracts and so forth in California, especially around or in Arizona, or all these places near Navy bases. I don't know that to be true. But anyway, there's kind of this interesting seed school connection. Now, I'm not saying this is in any way associated with Chris Clotworthy, but it does seem to be there's these interesting charter schools that are now public that are going into these communities, and the last place in the world you would expect kind of a suicide or a murder where the woman's name would not be released would be in one of those charter schools. It would certainly release her name. So here's Alan Krupnick. You can see his picture in the corner. He's also at Resources for the Future. Again, he's an associate. He's connected somehow with Chris Clotworthy, somebody who's connected very closely to the mining industry, very closely to the transportation industry of Uranium One, connected with Resources for the Future, Molly McCauley. were these Navy resources being used to identify key areas like this happened in the Teapot Dome scandal, where the area was set aside as valueless and then later oil was discovered on it? As a matter of fact, Richard Nixon, that's one of the stories of his family. It was all an orange grove until they discovered oil on it. It's a story he used to tell quite a bit. I think even in Anthony Hopkins' version of the Nixon biography, he tells that story over and over again. It really bothered Nixon. He always had that chip on his shoulder. I mean, Nixon maybe become the new Lloyd Finnegan. I know it's Lavoy Finicum kind of model. So anyway, those are just interesting feedbacks. But it was interesting that all the Chicago connections as well, Lincoln Park Zoo, and also L.A. connections.